Hi everyone, welcome back. So we are talking about Flowers for Algernon again. If you haven't seen the summary PowerPoint video and then my first talk, make sure you go back and watch those. So let's get started with today's topic. So last time we talked about the soft sciences, things like psychology, sociology, and the comparison between those and hard sciences. Soft science fiction books look at things like psychology and sociology and anthropology and all of those kinds of things. And we also talked about the narration of the book, the intensely focused characterization for a science fiction novel. This has a lot more focus on characterization than a lot of other books have. The plot of the book is really dependent on characterization because you have a man with an intellectual disability. He gains intelligence through an operation. Then that intelligence starts to fade away. And that character arc is the plot, watching him go through those changes. We talked about the reliability, the irony, and the other aspects of the narration. Then we also talked about religion as a theme in this book that kind of showcases a little bit more the journey that this character takes, not just intellectually, but also emotionally and spiritually. So today we are going to talk about the science of this science fiction, finally, in a little bit more depth. And we're also going to talk about the understanding of disability. So that's actually where I'm going to start, and I'm going to grab my notes here so that I can give you guys correct information, make sure I cover everything that I want to cover. Okay, so the book was published in 1959, and what you have to understand, I'm going to jump ahead and then I'll go backwards a little bit, so if you can follow me. The Americans with Disabilities Act, which really defined the rights of people with disabilities or differing abilities. The Americans with Disabilities Act was not passed in the United States until 1990. It was introduced in 1988, and all I can think about is like a group of people on one hand who are like, hey, people with disabilities should be treated humanely and with dignity. And people on the other group going, maybe. Like, we'll see, right? That really is the question of this book. I talked about this before, but the idea that this man is a human who should be treated with dignity no matter what kind of intelligence he has is really at the center of this book. And you have to kind of understand that, again, it was written in 30 years before the ADA Act. The American Disabilities Act. The Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, is an extension of Section 504, which was passed in 1973. And that's if you've heard of like 504 housing, Section 504 said that people receiving government funds could not be discriminated against in terms of those government funds. So, for things like education, housing, welfare, those types of things, you could not discriminate on basis of race or gender or disability, which comprised a large number of people getting benefits because of their needs and also because of how disabilities were classified at the time. So if we go back even before that and we look at 1941, we have a researcher called Edgar Dahl, and he comes up with medical definitions for intellectual disabilities. At that point in time, before that, they really didn't have medical definitions. Similar to in psychology, we have the DSM-4 or the DSM-5 or 6, if that's what they're on now. I don't know. And those are the diagnostic manual for psychological disorders. They have things like, here's what depression looks like. Here's what obsessive compulsive disorder looks like. Here's what bipolar looks like. Here's what eating disorders look like. And the thing about his system is that for intellectual disabilities, or at the time they would have called it mental retardation, it was based on, and this is the exact word they used, subnormality. So this idea that people who are intellectually disabled are below normal. Not even non-normality, but sub meaning under, like a submarine. So subnormal. And this caused, I think even before this, to a lot of fear and misunderstanding about people with disabilities. The idea that they could be criminal, the idea that they could, just by being there, kind of harm people. The classification system was expanded in the 1950s. And basically, there are three primary categories. You have educable, which are people who are able to be educated. They thought at the time that people could not go beyond a 4th grade level of development if they had an intellectual disability. We know now that that is completely false. I know a couple of people with disabilities who were born in like the 1970s, 1980s, who at the time they were told, or their parents were told, look, this person is not going to be above a 3rd grade education. This person is never going to be able to hold a job. One of the people that I know manages a grocery store and was perfectly capable through a lot of education, a lot of intervention, and a lot of help to eventually move up to that position. I think they worked there for a couple decades and started doing carts and then stocked shelves and then were taught the register and then eventually moved up. That is something that would never have happened had he been born in the 1950s instead of the 1980s. Never would have happened. And now someone else whose parents were told that they would always have to take care of them and that they should think about putting them in an institution when they were older. And they got them, again, educational intervention, a lot of training. And that person lives on his own, has a house, has a job, has a great life. Again, something that would not have happened. I know other people that I've worked with who were possibly on the autism spectrum, right? And categorized into different places because they were nonverbal for a period of time. And a lot of people on the autism spectrum are now running tech companies or teaching college classes, as the case may or may not be, right? So the idea has kind of come about now of differing abilities. And certainly there are people who are quite delayed, but that does not necessarily mean that they have to be institutionalized, which is what would have happened back then. There are group homes even today, and sometimes those group homes can be very beneficial. They are people who are living with other people like them. They have social interactions, they have education, and sometimes they have people to help them for different things, vocational stuff or just daily life things. If they have difficulty going to a shop or going to the library, those types of things. But essentially, educable, able to be educated was the first category. Trainable was the next category. Trainable meant that they could not really be educated, but they could be trained to do basic daily life skills. So things like showering, toileting themselves, all of those kind of things. They could be trained to do that. And then the last category underneath that is custodial. And custodial were really people who they looked at and they said they can't be trained, they can't be educated. You really need to just put them in a home or an institution and institutionalize them. And out of this came a lot of discrimination and a lot of problems for people. So I'm going to read you, this is from Dr. Bruce Capel. He worked with the Administration on Developmental Disabilities in Minnesota, and this was part of a grant project looking at the history of problems in how we treat disabled people, at least this section of his report. So here's what he said. In the 1950s, many decisions were made by guardians, and some common abuses included. Now, guardians, because the people in these three classifications were considered not able to take care of themselves. Sometimes you have people who really do need guardianship. But now that we have such a better understanding of differing abilities and disabilities, we don't have as many guardianships as was in the past. But here were some things. Forced sterilization of children and adults with disabilities so that they could not have a baby. Institutionalization, parents routinely institutionalizing their children. Permanent placement, where they refused to have the children back once the children were put in the institution for sometimes the purposes of being trained or being educated. Limited parent input and authority, where other guardians would take over. Lack of legal counsel, dehumanizing practices, so things like the denial of education, the denial of basic rights, such as receiving a driver's license, executing a will, marrying, subscribing to a magazine, executing a contract, managing their own property. A lot of times people were deemed incompetent and were not allowed to do this. Servitude. Institutions routinely used residents to do the work of the institution for minimal or no pay. You can see this if you read the book or watch the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. They have the people there doing the cleaning so that they don't have to pay people. And lack of treatment, lack of education, all of those kind of things, really people were being mistreated. And one of the big pushes in this book is to say, this guy is not just a human when he gains intelligence. He is a human being from the beginning of the book to the end of the book, and it does not matter how much intelligence he has. It does matter how people are treating him. And I'm getting fired up about this because it pisses me off. Having done some work in classrooms with people with disabilities, my father was a special education teacher. And I've worked with many people with disabilities. I have some disabilities of my own, including ADD, if you couldn't tell that from some of these lectures. But the mistreatment of people. Now, Charlie is in a situation where some people are mistreating him and other people are not. And then we have his teacher, Alice, who is really the first person almost, or at least almost the first person in his life to look at him as a human being. And he, even from the beginning of the book, is almost in love with her because she treats him with compassion and decency. So I want you to really look for the attitudes of the other researchers Charlie works with, the other scientists, who mistreats him and who treats him well. How does he pick up on that mistreatment, or does he not? The people that he works with and socializes with, the Faye later on who lives in his building, all of his mother, certainly, which we're going to get into in a minute, his mother and sister who kind of treat him like a freak in some kind of way. Watch for how all of these people treat him and look for what the author is saying. Like, we need to do better. That's what he's saying. And we can have all the scientific advancements we want, but if we don't treat people like human beings and we don't look at their humanity, what the hell does the science matter? It doesn't. It doesn't. So, tonight I got a little bit more upset about that than I thought. Sorry, guys. This book is so good. So let's talk about the science. The science of this book. There's a couple things here. The first thing I want to mention is the language. So I talked about the narration before. The science of linguistics, it is a soft science, but it is an actual science. I'm going to be giving you guys a video of another professor explaining a little bit better the science of linguistics, because I think it's really key to understanding this book. And he lays it out much more clearly than I could. But one of the things, and it's a 50-minute video, but you can just watch the first 10 minutes. You'll be fine. One of the things that he mentions is this idea that Carl Jung had, or the psychologist Carl Jung, that words were signs, that each letter is like a symbol, but then when put together, it means something concrete. Symbols usually abstract, word means something concrete. But Jung did some work with language, and looking at the symbolic nature of some words. And he wrote a work, I think either in 1904 or 1907, that looked at word association. So, for example, if I say the word knife, somebody's going to say fork, somebody's going to say cut, somebody might say stab, somebody might say bleed, somebody might say chef. If you're in our culinary program, you have chef knives. Somebody else might say something completely abstract that wouldn't make sense to anyone else, like automobile. Those don't seem to go together, right? If you've seen movies, you've seen people do this in movies, right? They have like kind of pseudo-psychological tests, and they'll say, it goes along with the Rorschach test, right? Where you try to see a picture in the ink blot. So one of the things I think the author is playing with a tiny bit here is the meaning of language. And we really see Charlie acquiring language as it goes. At the beginning, he has just learned to read. They did not think that he was in that category of being able to be educated. And then they kind of realize he is able to be educated, and they start allowing him to take some courses. And that's where he meets Alice, and he learns to read, he learns to write, but in a very rudimentary way. So I'd like you to watch that video and think about how it relates to this book. The second thing is talking about Jung. There are a couple other theories that Jung had. Again, theories, because now when we talk about psychology, a lot of psychology is rooted in biology. We have experimentation that follows the scientific hypothesis, seeing that through the scientific method, rather. You start with a hypothesis, you do observation, you do experimentation, you test your hypothesis. In the nascent beginning stages of psychology, by the 1950s, psychology really starts to explode as people from World War II are coming home and starting to get some treatment for some of the issues there. You have Freudian theories come into popular understanding, even though by this point they're about 50 years old, but they wrote in other languages by the time it came into English, and then people started practicing. But practicing psychologists, therapies, different types of therapies really starting to explode right at this point. And it's certainly in the 60s where people are really interested in emotion, more so. And you have things like Gestalt therapy and primal scream therapy and cognitive behavioral, which we actually still have today, right? So this is going to be kind of important as someone looks at popular psychology and tries to understand it and tries to kind of put it into a fictional context. So Jung is interested in language, but he's also interested in archetypes. And an archetype is what his theory was. Again, the early stages of psychology, a lot more philosophy than testing. Today, you'd have like a medication that would undergo testing, and that would be part psychological and part biological. But back then, they were like, maybe somebody's messed up because their mother messed up. Then that's a theory that you can have. And that's Freud, and we'll talk about him in a minute. But anyway. So an archetype. Jung's theory on archetypes is that if you look at literature from various cultures over various time periods, you have these types of the damsel in distress, the princess, the wise old man, the old crone, the wicked stepmother, these things that like you can think of in fairy tales. But if you've ever seen the website TV Tropes, you can see a lot of these archetypes in there. A lot of writing uses tropes and then kind of plays with them. But the three women in this story, who are the most prominently featured, are Rose, the author, Charlie's mother, Alice, his teacher, and Faye, who is his sexual partner at one point. And in a very 1950s masculine way, these women really are reflections of Charlie himself. I think that they really exist more. It's like, I don't know if you guys have noticed this in, like, say, an Adam Sandler movie. The women are there like, this is a prize that I won. Unless Drew Barrymore stars in it. But typically, a love interest of the main character, right? And they reflect back and make the main character a little bit more masculine. So that is a little bit of what's going on here. We have these archetypes of the wicked. She's not a stepmother, but she's like a cold mother figure in Rose, who has her own faults and her own humanity that we see later. She's not completely pictured as a villain, but certainly did not treat him well. Alice is this like Madonna type figure, Madonna being Mary, the mother of God. A lot of people at the time and even today think that Mary lived at least part of her life without sin in the Bible. And then Faye, who is basically the archetype of a whore. So you have this Madonna whore complex going on, or dichotomy, where there's one woman who's really put on a pedestal, another woman who is kind of hypersexualized and is using him for sexual purposes as much as he is using her. So, the archetypes here are going to be a little bit important. Jung also had, I'd like you to just watch and see, especially how the women are characterized. You also have the archetype of the mad scientist. You can question and see if that's in here as well. Jung also theorized about dreams. There is a lot here in terms of Charlie's dreams. We talked last time about the idea that once something is in your mind, it's there forever. He does have flashbacks. He does have dreams of various items, objects that kind of show trauma from his past. So I'd like you to kind of look for that as well. What are his dreams? What are they supposed to symbolize? And then outside of Jung, we have a lot of Freud. This book is basically, in my opinion, kind of a fictionalized version of Freudian psychology in a way. Freud is someone who has been largely discredited today, but is really more well known for talk therapy. But some of his theories, again, not scientific, but it's very interesting how they play out here. So there's two in particular. The first is the idea that the mind is split into three kind of parts. The id, which holds the base sexual impulses, fear, things like eating and excreting and sleep and all of that is driven by the id. I don't know why, but I think of it like being here, like right by the medulla. Got it. The superego, in contrast, is the thing that has the moral center of the mind. And then you have the ego, which is our waking mind, and that kind of goes in between and navigates our base instincts with our more spiritual instincts. And in terms of Charlie's development, you really see the ego trying very hard to navigate between those base instincts and between a higher understanding of things. Again, religion playing a little bit of part of this, spiritual development, but really more importantly is the psychosocial development. And this is something, again, I really did not realize until I read this book again as an adult and then again in preparing for this course, that it is quite a sexual book. And I don't mean that there are sex scenes, but I mean that it really is concerned with looking at this guy almost as if he's going from childhood to adulthood in the matter of months, which I think is kind of discriminatory against people with disabilities, but that's sort of how he's depicted. So in that, if you went through all of puberty in like a month, what would that be like? Crap. right? Puberty, we used to think was like 13, 14, 15, but now we know that the brain doesn't fully develop until you're about 23, 24. So the changes that you went through from 13 to 23 are in this book. He's going through all of that in a short period of time. And he has to navigate between this higher intellectual understanding that he has of the world and then this very base instinct of sex and like this weird like wanting sex, but having that be drilled into him as a kid, as somebody with an intellectual disability, that he was not allowed to do that he was not allowed to look at girls or think about girls. One time he accidentally sees his sister in the shower and he's basically like beaten and abused for it and yelled at and in kind of a scarring way. And the idea that he might hurt somebody, again, discrimination and not looking at his humanity, right? But the other way that the id, the ego, and the superego come out are in these women. Faye really is pure id. She is driven by sexual impulses. She's really depicted kind of as like, we don't use this word now, but like a bimbo, that she cares about sex, that she's willing to have sex with this guy because he lives in the building and he's kind of cute and he seems sort of nice. And then we have Alice, who really is held up on this pedestal of being this Madonna figure. She's almost perfect. And she is like really the moral center of the book and trying to give Charlie the moral guidance that he needs throughout the entire process as she goes from being his teacher to being his friend to being a potential love interest, and those kinds of changes. So really look for the ways that Charlie struggles with his sexuality. We're going to talk about that more in just a second, but his emotional growth, we talked about his spiritual growth last time, but the pain that he's going through, the intense pain that this causes. People always think the end of this book is sad, but I think that really you can see him struggling through really almost the whole book of trying to fit in socially and trying to grapple with these new emotions and having, his world turned upside down. If you know the allegory of Plato's cave, the idea is that there are these people who are facing the wall of a cave and there's fire behind them, so they only see these flickerings and shadows on the wall, right? And then they come away from their chains and they turn around and they see the real light for the first time. And the idea is kind of like this. You are coming to a full understanding of who you are. We see this again in Frankenstein. We see it in stories about sentient robot life, right? That you have this sudden awakening, and that this awakening has disadvantages as well as advantages. The other Freudian idea that's here has to do with the mother. Freud blamed a lot on mothers. Now, I will say, again, even though I think most of his theories are crap, you do have a really good understanding now of how we do have today, because of psychology, a better understanding of how trauma affects people. And you can kind of see 100 or 200 years ago, how they would have looked at people with trauma and said, well, how did they get that way? And how did that happen? Why is this person so anxious or so depressed? Well, maybe it was something in their past. Well, at that point in time, the mother was responsible for a lot of that person's growth and development, right? And so that a lot of things get blamed on mom, and this book is no exception. So I'd like you to look for Rose and her part of it, and how Charlie kind of comes to understand that she is just kind of a human doing her best, and also working within this framework of believing that disabilities are harmful and that they're bad, and that she must be broken as a person for having a son who had a disability. I think a lot of her psychology is kind of based in that idea. The other part about the mother is that Alice, again, treating Charlie kindly, becomes almost a mother figure to him. So that by the time they've grown closer, they're sharing ideas on an equal level, and then he becomes a little bit above her, which in 1950s would have made it therefore acceptable. The woman is no longer the smartest one in the relationship. Some 1950s cultural psychology for you. But by the time he comes to that place, emotionally, and in the back of his mind, in his id, Alice is still a mother figure. And it's very difficult for him to try to overcome that thought, to think of her as a sexual being who he could actually be with. And it causes a real crisis for him. So the basic ideas here, just to kind of recap and wrap up. Look for the ways that people with disabilities are treated. Think about how far we've come in the 60 plus years since this book was written. Think about the ways that the author is calling for us to do better and treat people with disabilities with humanity and with dignity. And then really consider the psychology of the book. The Jungian psychology in terms of the archetypes, the use of language, the symbolism of dreams, and then especially, because it's on every page, in every sentence, the Freudian psychology, the psychosocial development, the emotional development, and the ways in which the id, the ego, and the superego are kind of battling in Charlie throughout the whole book. And how does that really cause tension? Because again, for a science fiction book, this is really character driven, and the tension and the conflict are internal. There are a few external conflicts, a little bit with the scientists, a little bit with his mother, a little bit with the women in his life, but pretty much this is a man versus self kind of story. And I think that there are a lot of layers to this book, even though it's a user-friendly book. As I said, a lot of people in high school read at least a version of it, at least a censored version of it. There's a lot more going on. So I hope that you like the book. I hope you appreciate it. I hope that you kind of see it for what it is, which is this beautiful story that does, I think, hold up today, but also is really a product of its time and the understanding of science at the time, the understanding of disability, and certainly the understanding of psychology. And so for that, I think it's great. I think it's great both ways. That's it. That's it for today. I can't wait to see what you guys say in the discussion boards, and I can't wait to read your thoughts on the book. Thanks.